Sometimes I really want to enjoy a good glass of wine, but I don't want to finish the whole bottle. So what's a wine lover to do? Keeping wine from turning into vinegar is a problem that's existed for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. Wines were traded all around the Mediterranean. They were stored in amphora. That kept the wine fresh when it was transported from country to country. Later, oak casks were used, and finally in the 17th century, glass bottles were invented with cork stoppers. That ensured wine could be bottled at its point of origin, and it could survive transport to be consumed at a later time. However, what happens when you actually open that wine? Nowadays, the most common thing is to put the cork back on and stick it in the fridge. I've found for white wines, it's more effective. Sometimes those wines can stay fresh for up to a week. Red wines oxidize a little quicker. In 3 to 4 days, you start to notice a difference in flavor. In essence, wine wants to become vinegar. When it's exposed to oxygen, it starts to break down the wine starts to oxidize, and that journey begins. That's why wines change over time when they're in the bottle. So wine preservation systems are meant to slow down that process to limit the exposure to oxygen. I have 4 common ones here. We're going to test out which one is the best. The first one we have is the Vacuvin, or the pump system. For this system to work, you have to remove the cork, thus exposing the wine to oxygen. You stick in this rubber stopper, you stick the Vacuvin on top, and you pump out the excess air. This is the most inexpensive option. You used to see it in wine bars often. I've found that they only work for about a week, but I'm looking forward to testing it compared to some of these other systems. The next system is one that I've been enthusiastic about lately. It's called the Repour. You have to remove the cork in order to use the Repour, so you are exposing the wine to a little bit of oxygen. However, you take one of these stoppers, this Repour, inside there's sealed copper that absorbs oxygen, keeping the wine from going bad. I found this to be super effective, but is it the best? We're gonna see. The other two are the Coravin systems. We have the Coravin pivot. For this system, you do have to remove the cork as well. You stick the specialty stopper on the top of the bottle. You then stick this system into the rubber stopper. You squirt argon gas into the bottle, and that displaces wine. Argon is heavier than air, so it creates a little barrier between the wine and oxygen. The gold standard is the Coravin needle-based system. For this to work, you don't have to remove the cork. It uses a medical grade needle that goes through the cork. You shoot a layer of argon in there. That displaces wine. Wine comes out. Then you pull out the Coravin system, the cork reseals, and voila, your wine's good. For this test, I have 2 wines, 1 white wine, 1 red wine. We're going to use these systems, store these bottles in a cool basement for 3 weeks. Then I'm going to blind taste them against a fresh bottle, see which system wins out. The white wine I have is the Trinchero Quattro Theory. This is Sauvignon Blanc from Napa Valley 2022. This is mostly Sauvignon Blanc with a touch of Semillon, so it's a white Bordeaux blend. Most of it is made in stainless steel with a touch of barrel aging. I have not tasted this yet. Quattro Theory brings together the winemakers, the vineyards, the winemaking process, and the experience. This comes in at $26, so I'm looking forward to tasting it. I'm going to remove a significant amount of wine so the wine has a chance to be exposed to some oxygen, making the test more valid. For this first one, I'm going to use the Vacuvin, so I'm going to stick in the rubber stopper, and then I'm going to pump out all this air. Okay, let's give this wine a taste here. Sauvignon Blanc, I'm usually not a big fan from Napa. Sometimes I think they can be too ripe. This smells rather under control. Pear, white peach, yellow peach. It has some Thai basil. Sometimes Napa Sauvignon Blanc, I can't really... Double blind, maybe you wouldn't be able to tell it's Sauvignon Blanc because it's a lot different than those you're experienced from the Loire in France or New Zealand. This has got plenty of fruit. It's not super grassy. It's zingy. Sauvignon Blanc is known for its acidity. It's got a long finish. I mean, this is pretty serious wine. I think it's pretty delicious. I mean, if I was scoring it, I'd probably be in the 90+ point range. I think it's very good. Okay, let me check and see if all the bottles are the same. I gotta admit, that was pretty good for a guy that doesn't love Sauvignon Blanc from Napa. I hope all these bottles are exactly the same. Well, we're gonna check. Let me dump out the same amount. For this bottle, I'm gonna use the Repour. To use the Repour, there's a little foil tab right here. You're gonna peel that off and you're just gonna stick it right on the bottle. When you use a Repour though, you cannot store the bottle on its side. You gotta store it upright. Same wine, we're all good. Let's move on to the third bottle. So with the Coravin pivot, you have to put in this special rubber stopper. You gotta stick it in the bottle. Then you take the Coravin pivot, you stick the metal tip right through the topper. You tilt the bottle at a 45-degree angle and you pour out the wine. When you're done, you just remove the Coravin pivot and then seal the bottle. Let's see if this one is the same. Same wine, we're good to go. Last bottle, we're gonna use the Coravin. Coravin needs a little bit more training. You set the Coravin unit on top of the bottle and you push the needle straight through. You tilt the bottle at a 45-degree angle and you start pouring out the wine. I personally love the Coravin, although I think recently I've had a few bottles go bad on me, but for the most part, I think it's the gold standard in terms of keeping wines fresh, but I guess we'll see in this taste test. There is a touch of user error with the Coravin. You have to train your staff. When you're all done, you just hold the bottle, pull the Coravin right out. Let's see here. All the bottles were exactly the same wine. Let's move on to the red. Next up, we have the Quattro Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa 2021. Fantastic vintage in Napa. This is mostly Cabernet Sauvignon with a little bit of Malbec, Merlot, Petit Verdot, and Cabernet Franc. So a true Bordeaux blend. This comes in at the $50 range, which is a rarity for Napa Cabernet Sauvignon these days. Not too oaky at all, though it smells quite young. Blackberry fruit, a lot of blackberry, cassis, black raspberry. There's a little bit of a savage note to it. It smells really good. It's not a big, overt Napa Cab. It's fruity, but yet there's a little bit of refinement there. It's not too oaky at all. The oak comes a little bit more on the palate. It's not a massive wine. The tannins are quite pliant. What they do, they kind of coat the mouth. Honestly, for me, this is like a 92-point type of wine. I think that's pretty good. And for Napa Cab at that price point, that gets me excited. Let me check and see if all the other wines are the same. Good, all the same, no bottle variation. I'm gonna store these for 3 weeks in a cool basement. It's the end of the fall. We're gonna check back. We're gonna blind taste in 3 weeks. I'll see you then. Okay, exactly 4 weeks have passed. I've done a lot of traveling. My hair's gotten longer. It's getting a little bit colder. I'm excited to do this. I've got a fresh bottle of white, a fresh bottle of red. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna open this up, taste it, then I'm gonna taste all these 4 blind and see which one is closest to the fresh bottle. Funny, for just a simple video, it took a lot of work to put this together. Had to have somebody help me mix these up too. I was impressed with the Sauvignon Blanc. Like I said, I'm not usually a huge Napa Sauvignon Blanc guy, so let's give this a smell here. Still explosive, still very nice. Exactly like I remember it, full of fruit. It's bright, it's actually really delicious, has some body. Let's start out with wine number 1 here. Let's see if it's close. Wine 1 is almost identical. Okay, maybe it's not as explosive as this fresh one, but I think for a lot of people, if you wouldn't have tried this fresh one first, wouldn't tell a difference. It still smells like freshly opened wine. Here's the kicker. On the palate, it's not oxidized at all, but it lost a little bit of its vibrancy. Still very good, not as good as the fresh one. Let's move on to wine 2 here. Wine 2 also smells very good. So the first 2, no duds so far. The first 2 systems, aromatics are holding together really nice, which is difficult for white wines. This is so interesting. 2 has all the acidity, vibrancy. It lost just a touch of fruit, where I think 1 had all the fruit going on. 2 just lost maybe just I gotta go back and compare. That's weird. Still pretty good. Let's move on to number 3. I feel like the Vacuvin would do the worst, but so far I haven't found anything bad. Let's see. 3, still very drinkable, just not popping so much. But it still smells good, like it lost a little bit of its vibrancy. Wow. On the palate, it still finishes really nice. It lost just a touch of its vibrancy in the nose. 4 is not pretty at all anymore. Shoot, it's not as explosive. It still smells good. I think 4 is my least favorite. It doesn't feel as fruity on the palate. These are closer than I thought. I thought the Vacuvin would stand out. Okay. I thought the Vacuvin would absolutely get crushed. This says a lot about storage. All these were stored in a cool, cold basement, not a cellar, but basically cellar-like conditions. I think all of these systems are suitable. 1 and 2 were a little bit better than 3 and 4. 4. This was my least favorite just because the fruit wasn't as vibrant, but it still smelled pretty good. Let's take a look and see here. The Vacuvin system, this finished in last place with the white wine. Still a very solid showing. I'm impressed with Vacuvin. Go Vacuvin. Let's move on to number 3 here. Let's take a look here. Wow. Number 3 was the Coravin needle-based system. Like I said, just lost a touch of his fruit. The finish was still there. Coravin usually is the needle system as the gold standard. Wow, so the pivot or the Repour is what I preferred. And in those systems, you actually have to take off the cork, so there is going to be a little bit of exposure to air. That really surprises me. I was splitting hairs. If I could combine the pop of number 1 with the fruit of number 2, then I think it would be absolutely perfect. It would be the same as the fresh wine. In that regard, number 1, it had acidity, but I wanted a little bit more fruit. Let's see a look at what it is. It's the Repour. So it still showed super well. I mean, it was neck and neck. Between these two, it was like 0.25 in points. So the Coravin Pivot is the winner for white wine just by a hair. Like I said, if it was a scoring, it'd be like a quarter of a point. That's really impressive. Again, I'm really impressed with the Vacuvin. That's a cheap, inexpensive option. It does not taste as good, but I think it's passable for sure. Give this a little rinse because it had some Sauvignon Blanc in it. Okay, hopefully it's not corked. Not corked at all. Still lots of blackberry, black cassis, raspberry, mocha. Exactly as I remember it. Let's move on here. So for you, it'd be right to left. Let's go with this one here. Number 1. Let's see how this is. I'm really excited to see if the reds show any different. Number 1 just shows a touch of oxidation, where fresh fruit flavors turn into more dried fruit flavors, just a touch. On the palate, it's still popping. The fruit isn't there as much. The nose is the only tip off for me. Yeah, the nose is the only difference for me, but these are like slight, subtle differences. I still think it's a serviceable wine. Let's move on to number 2. 2 is not as aromatic, but it's not oxidized at all. Wow, there might be more of a variance in the red wines. It still smells good. It's not as popping as the fresh open bottle. I have to say, the palate is very nice, and even the tannins are a little bit more rounded. I think the palate, both on 1 and 2, were very good. 1, the nose bothered me just a slight bit. 2 was pretty close. Let's move on to number 3. 3 also smells like the fruit fell off. The whites were pretty similar. Like the whites were really close. The reds, I see a touch more variance. The palate on 3 is the closest to the original bottle, because in all these 3 so far, the only thing that was slightly different was the aromatics. This one was a little bit oxidized. These 2 were a little bit more muted, but it was on the palate, it was really nice. Number 3, in fact, the palate is really, really good. My favorite so far. Let's move on to number 4. 4 also is a little bit oxidized, actually quite a bit. 4 I don't like at all. It's tired, it's dead. It's the first wine out of these 8 that, to me, I wouldn't drink. You ready for the reveal? In last place, number 4, which we just tasted. I thought it was gone. I thought it was oxidized. I think it's gonna be the Vacuvin. What do you know? It is. It's the Vacuvin system. This one, it's not drinkable after a month. I don't like it at all. It's number 1 here. It was just a touch oxidized. However, the palate was still nice, bright, and fresh. I'm looking forward to seeing what this is. The Coravin pivot system, because there had to be a little bit of oxygen to interact with the wine. That's why at the top the nose was a little bit gone. The palate was still very nice. The nose bothered me a tad bit, so I'm not as excited about drinking it, whereas in the whites I think I would drink anything. Let's move on to the next 2. These were close. I thought number 3 was the one that was the closest. Number 2, just the nose slightly had lost some pop, but on the palate it was still the same. So we'll finishing in second place here, what we have the Coravin needle-based system for the reds. Wow, it's so that's so funny. Still very good, just a touch of a difference. And let's start out. The winner for the red wines is the Repour system. That is fascinating. So some of my conclusions here, actually the Vacuvin performed better than whites than I expected. Although I have found for fresh white wines, they stay pretty stable as long as you keep them in a cold temperature. For the reds, the Repour and the Coravin system, the 2 systems I depend on when it comes to red wine, showed the best. The Coravin, at least you can store it more. The Repour, you can't necessarily cellar it. If it were me personally and I was on a tight budget, I would have at least one of the Coravin systems handy, especially for red wines. I would probably go with a needle-based system because you can still store sort of wines, and then I would have a lot of Repours handy because those always work. I also want to thank Trinchero Family Estates for providing these wines, otherwise this wouldn't have happened. Tell me, what kind of wine preservation system do you trust? Was this helpful to you? Leave it in the comments below.